Exceptional learning. We're going to talk about people with disabilities. We're mostly going to talk about people with ADHD and the TAG program, the Talented and Gifted program. These are exceptional children, as they say. As a matter of fact, I had never taken a class dealing with this because I got my teaching license before 94 142 was passed, and I needed to understand exceptional children. So I took a class. When I was in Oklahoma, I took two classes actually about exceptional children. So that was interesting. I'd never seen that before. And so let's go ahead and get started. There you go. Exceptional learning, attention, giftedness, creativity, and the family. IDEA specifically addresses many disability categories. It does not target every special needs situation. The most notable exception is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. ADHD is a possible qualifying condition under the IDEA category of other health impaired, not a separate disability category. IDEA lists the following as possible qualifying conditions under the OHI category, the other health impaired category. Asthma, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or attention deficit disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, diabetes, epilepsy, a heart condition, hemophilia, lead poisoning, leukemia, nephritis, rheumatic fever, and sickle cell anemia. This means that students with ADHD could receive services under IDEA. In 2018, in a study in 2018, 2,495 children with ADHD aged 4 to 17 years found that 42.9% of the students received services under IDEA compared to 13.6% receiving service under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And that adds up to what, 56.5% of the individuals suffering from ADHD. Other students with special learning needs are not addressed at all under IDEA. Students who are gifted and talented or exceptionally creative also require specialized education. We're going to talk about them at the end of the chapter. Another educationally relevant law is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. The ADA legislation is another civil rights law. The primary difference between ADA and Section 504 is how broadly the law applies. Section 504 applies to programs or activities receiving federal funding. ADA applies to business, other public and private institutions, and their access for people with disabilities. Since the ADA legislation is not limited to the federally funded institutions, this means it has even broader application. The only entities excluded from ADA are churches and private clubs. So everybody else has to be sure that they can help the people with disabilities. They can't discriminate. Only churches and private clubs can discriminate. Children ages 2 through 9 varies by state, can receive services using the non-categorical development delay provision in the law. And this is kind of a problem because each state has their own rules, each state has their own laws. And because of this, sometimes people will move from one state to the next and find out that what was covered in the state they just came from is not covered in the state that they're going to. Now, of course, if you were a parent with a child with a special need, then probably you would determine this before you decided to move. Without satisfactorily meeting the criteria for one or more of these categories, a student does not qualify for special education services. Section 504 and ADA use a non-categorical approach to defining a disability. These laws extend protections to any person who has a mental or physical impairment interfering with major life functioning and has a record of such impairment and or who is regarded as having such impairment. What this means is that Section 504 and ADA are much broader than the IDEA legislation. Many students who fail to meet criteria for a disability under IDEA may qualify for services under Section 504 and ADA. The non-discrimination goal is to protect students from discriminatory practices based on their disability in all institutions, including education. Now, remember when I was in school from 1955 until 1967, we discriminated. The schools discriminated. They could tell somebody that, I'm sorry, your disability, we can't afford to accommodate your disability, and they couldn't. That was the law at that time. And then, of course, all the laws were passed. 142 was passed, and Section 504 and ADA were passed. This does not mean that the students who meet criteria for disability according to Section 504 and ADA criteria are entitled to all the same services and educational opportunities as non-disabled students. This is because, in addition to a disability, some students have other issues limiting their participation in educational activities. It is only discrimination if a student is not permitted to participate in an activity for which they are otherwise qualified. The mandate for a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, is a minimally defined construct. Essentially, students with and without disabilities are entitled to services necessary to ensure an appropriate educational experience. This may include regular education, special education, supplementary aids, and other related services outside the general education setting. Section 504 requires that schools gather information from a variety of sources and that a group of individuals knowledgeable about the student consider the information. Students should be educated with their non-disabled peers as much as possible. The law also requires periodic reevaluations to determine current functioning and appropriate supports. Evaluations for services under Section 504 and ADA attempt to determine the answer to three important questions. Does a physical or mental impairment exist? Does the physical or mental impairment cause a limitation in major life functioning? What are the accommodations that will ensure the student receives a free and appropriate public education? There is probably no other disorder receiving more media coverage than attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It is the most commonly diagnosed disorder of childhood and is having a significant impact on education. ADHD is defined as a behavioral issue characterized by one or more of the following symptoms: inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. Now, one of the things that you need to remember about ADHD, sometimes it's organic and sometimes it's caused by the environment. And there are lots of problems that the individual could have in their environment that would cause them to be hyperactive and attention deficit. Things like, what am I thinking of? Alcoholism in the family, child abuse can cause these types of reactions. So one of the things that needs to happen when somebody is diagnosed with ADHD is determining if it is an organic problem or if it is an environmental problem. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's National Survey of Children's Health found that 9.8% of school-aged children ages 3 to 17 suffered from ADHD in 2016 through 2019. That's 1 out of every 10 children was suffering from ADHD. This means that approximately 6 million children have significant problems with impulsive behavior, hyperactivity, or difficulty directing attention. This is an enormous population and one that is not directly served by the special education system. Diagnosis since COVID-19 has doubled. I looked this up. I was surprised. I was surprised that it had doubled. So there are about one out of every five children in school now is suffering from ADHD. And part of the problem, of course, was environmental. Now, the environmental problems you can't cure with medication. If it's organic, yeah, you can give the individual Ritalin. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. You can give them medication and it will take care of their problem. If it's an environmental problem, then that's not going to help. It's not really going to help. And one of the things that we see, or we have seen in the past, and I'm not sure what the statistics are now, that the stimulants, the amphetamines that we give individuals suffering from ADHD, the stimulants only help about 75%. And the reason is because the rest is environmental. And of course, just by giving them speed isn't going to alleviate their problem. One of the major controversies surrounding ADHD is whether it really exists. In 2002, an international conference on ADHD was held to develop a science-based consensus statement addressing conflicting media and scientific reports. This consensus paper reports that the U.S. Surgeon General, the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the American Psychological Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics all recognize ADHD as a valid disorder. Now, you may ask yourself, now how in the world can somebody argue against ADHD as not a problem? And the answer is, remember, about 75% of the individuals are suffering from an organic form of ADHD. About 25% is environmental. Now, if you're looking at mostly individuals that are suffering from ADHD due to environmental situations, then you can call it something else. You don't have to call it, you don't have to admit that there is a problem organically, because there isn't in these cases. And this is part of the argument back and forth. So there's a whole branch of psychology that denies almost all mental illnesses, including, of course, ADHD. Now, the interesting thing is that my daughter, who teaches high school, also doesn't think that there is ADHD. And the reason she doesn't think that is because most of the individuals that she's dealing with that have ADHD that's more environmental than anything else. Now, one of the things that we're going to discover, potentially one of the things that we're going to discover with this huge increase of ADHD due to COVID-19 is that most of it is environmental. Most of the increase is environmental. So it doesn't make any sense that more organic people with organic ADHD problems would come out of the woodwork just because of a change in school settings and whatnot. So we'll have to keep an eye on this, and we have to understand that sometimes this is a problem that exists because of the environment, and sometimes this is a problem that exists because of the chemicals in the individual's brain. ADHD is widely recognized and addressed in educational settings. Schools typically recognize a medical approach to the diagnosis of ADHD. This means schools rely on the diagnosis of a medical professional for identification of ADHD. The standard diagnostic reference for identifying ADHD is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, DSM-5, came out in 2013. This publication is produced by the American Psychiatric Association and is a compilation of diagnostic criteria and information on a wide range of disorders. And we're going to talk about the symptoms now. The inattention symptoms: overlooking or missing details, or making careless mistakes in schoolwork, at work, or when engaging in other activities. One of the things that we need to understand is that it's not only in children, but it's also in adults. And sometimes, well, anyway, it's in adults as well. So these criteria don't not only include adolescents, children, adolescents, they also include adults. Frequent difficulty staying focused when at work or play. Attention seems to wander during direct conversations, even when distractions are lacking. Frequent failure to follow through on instructions, or easily sidetracked from schoolwork, work duties, or chores. Difficulty organizing tasks and activities, for example, unable to manage sequential tasks, keeping belongings in order, organizing workspace, manage time, meet uh, deadlines. Avoidance, dislike, or reluctance to engage in tasks such as homework or preparing reports that require sustained mental effort. Commonly loses items needed to accomplish tasks or activities, for example, papers, books, pencils, keys, eyeglasses, cell phones. Easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. In older adolescents and adults, these distractions may be unrelated thoughts. Okay, these are the symptoms for the hyperactivity and impulsivity: fidgeting with hands or feet, or squirming while seated, rising during a seated activity instead of remaining seated as is expected, running around or climbing at inappropriate times in adolescents and adults. This may manifest as restlessness. Difficulty quietly playing or engaging in leisure activities. Uncomfortable being still for extended periods of time, always seems to be on the go or driven by a motor, making it difficult for others to keep up. Talking excessively, often blurts out answers even before a question has been completed. Uncomfortable waiting in line, or waiting to take their turn. Interrupts or intrudes on activities such as conversations or games. Uses others' things without requesting or receiving permission. In older adolescents and adults, this may include intruding on or even taking over someone else's task. Some impairment causing hyperactive, impulsive, or inattentive symptoms were present before age 12. This is the criteria for the diagnosis. It has to occur before age 12. Multiple inattentive or hyperactive impulse symptoms are present in two or more settings: at home, school, work, or other activities, or in the family, relatives, or friends. When with the family, relatives, or friends, the symptoms clearly interfere with or reduce functioning in academic, social, or occupational settings. Symptoms are not present during schizophrenic or psychotic disorder, or explainable by another mental disorder such as anxiety, dissociative personality, mood disorder, or intoxication. Okay, wait a second. The three cardinal symptoms of ADHD are inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. Students experiencing inattention have difficulty with tasks requiring sustained attention. They often they are often distractible and characterized as daydreamers. That's what he's doing. Impulsivity describes problems students have regulating their behavior. They often speak out of turn and have trouble taking turns. These behaviors frequently translate into social problems. Hyperactivity often results in difficulty sitting quietly in their seat. They may also demonstrate an atypical need to run and climb, and may talk excessively. Symptoms must be present before age 12. We've already talked about that. This helps the diagnostician separate children who have a long-standing problem from those whose symptoms may be a reaction to a current life event. And that's the environment that I was talking about before. The diagnostic criteria also specify that symptoms must be demonstrated in more than one setting. Usually it's at school and at home. If symptoms were only present in one setting, then again, they may indicate a specific reaction problem rather than an enduring problem. They don't like school, they don't like the teacher, they're being bullied at school. That might be a environmental situation. The problems must be causing significant social, academic, or occupational dysfunction. This is a typical qualifier for disorders listed in DSM-5 and follows the idea that a disorder must have some negative consequences for the individual to warrant a clinical diagnosis. If there's no problem with the individual, if it's not disrupting anything, then it's not going to be diagnosed. There are several lines of research pointing to a strong genetic component to ADHD. Research on parents and their children have found that a child with ADHD is 2 to 8 times more likely to have a parent with ADHD. Additionally, research on first-degree relatives has shown that there is an 18% chance of a biological parent having ADHD if their child has ADHD. This is compared to only 6% chance if the child with ADHD was adopted. Biological parents of children without ADHD had only a 3% chance of having ADHD themselves. Twin research supports the heritability theory of ADHD. A common approach is for researchers to look at identical twins who have the same genetics and fraternal twins who only share about 50% of their genes. If ADHD is more likely in identical twins, called concordance rate, compared to a fraternal twin pair, then this suggests a genetic explanation for ADHD. Numerous researchers have found higher ADHD concordance rates in identical twins. Studies vary in exact concordance rates, but rates for identical twins generally range from 60 to 80%, compared to 20 to 30% for fraternal twins. This evidence, coupled with the work on relatives and adoptees, provides strong evidence for the heritability theory of ADHD. Another theoretical approach to understanding the causes of ADHD is to associate their behavioral problems with evidence of biological or neurological differences. Research over the last 20 years has emphasized the importance of a certain brain structure involved in ADHD. The most reported differences are in areas of the frontal lobes and a set of deep brain structures called the basal ganglia. That's the thalamus. This is the basal. The whole green area is the basal ganglia, and the frontal lobe, the prefrontal lobe is this front section right here of the frontal lobe. The frontal lobes are involved in several aspects of self-regulation, and the basal ganglia are known to influence motor behavior. Researchers have found that children with ADHD have lower levels of the brain chemical dopamine. Findings indicate lower levels of dopamine in the frontal lobes and basal ganglia. In addition to anatomical and chemical differences, researchers have also found differences in brain electrical activity. Studies have shown that individuals with ADHD tend to have smaller overall brain volume compared to those without the disorder. Specific regions such as the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum have been found to be reduced in size. And there's the prefrontal cortex, as you can see. It's not exactly as extensive. It's more like that chunk right there. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive functions like decision making and impulse control, may contribute to the impulsivity and inattention observed in ADHD patients. Functional MRI studies have also revealed differences in brain activity in individuals with ADHD. That's the prefrontal cortex right there. There's a reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex during tasks that require attention and impulse control. There's increased activity in the default mode network, a network active during rest and associated with mind wandering. This heightened DMN default mode network activity might explain the distractibility characteristic of ADHD. Studies have explored the connectivity between different brain regions in individuals with ADHD. There's evidence of altered connectivity, especially between the prefrontal cortex and other brain regions. This disrupted connectivity might contribute to the difficulties in attention regulation and impulse control observed in ADHD. Executive functioning refers to a collection of skills involved in self-regulation, planning, internalization of speech, perception of time, and some aspects of working memory. The executive functioning perspective fits well with the available biological and neurological evidence because executive functions are known to have a biological foundation in the frontal lobes. One of the most notable of the executive functions is self-regulation. Children with ADHD often have difficulty with monitoring and managing their own behavior. This has obvious implications for schools since students are increasingly taught self-reliance. Another important executive function is the ability to plan for future activities. Children with ADHD often report that time moves too slowly. They have trouble waiting and allocating time effectively to tasks. This leads to frustration and difficulty with task performance. Children with ADHD may have a potential problem with working memory. Information flowing to and from working memory involves crucial executive functioning. To effectively manage our day, we need to be able to efficiently retrieve memories and integrate those memories into events of our immediate world. These memories must be reconciled with what is happening in the classroom at the moment. Juggling of information and working memory is challenging for all of us, but children with ADHD have more difficulty with this important executive function. The process of obtaining an initial diagnosis of ADHD is highly variable. Concerns about overdiagnosis and inconsistent diagnoses have led to more systematic approaches to assessment. The American Academy of Pediatrics attempted to create a more consistent and holistic approach to diagnosis by publishing evaluation guidelines. These guidelines incorporate the DSM-5 criteria. These guidelines are a positive step forward in the evaluation of ADHD. They encourage practitioners to consider multiple sources of information, creating a more comprehensive diagnostic approach. Still, many school systems find the guidelines fail to provide enough detail to produce the highest quality evaluation. Stage 1 is screening. Stage 2 is multi-method assessment of ADHD. Stage 3 is interpretation of results. Stage 4, develop a treatment plan. And stage 5 is assessment of the treatment plan. A significant part of any evaluation for ADHD is the assessment tools used to gather information on the child's functioning. Behavior rating scales are one of the most common tools professionals use to assess ADHD. Many types of rating scales are available, and most follow a similar format. The respondent is asked to read questions about the individual's behavior and provide a rating as to how much of the behavior is exhibited. Using this approach, evaluators can quickly gather information across many areas of functioning. Another type of assessment tool used in assessment of ADHD is the Continuous Performance Test. The Continuous Performance Test is a test designed to measure an individual's ability to sustain attention. One test, the Test of Variables of Attention 9, or TOVA, uses a simple computer display that only presents two symbols. The student is to press a button when the target symbol is shown and refrain from pressing the button when the non-target is displayed. The test is 22 minutes long and requires no reading skills. Although the task appears simple, the length of the test sufficiently challenges the student so that individuals with attentional difficulties perform differently from individuals without attentional issues. One of the most common treatment approaches to ADHD is stimulant medication. The rationale behind providing stimulants for students with ADHD is like the reason many adults drink coffee in the morning. Coffee contains caffeine, which is also a stimulant. Stimulants have an interesting dose-response curve. We behave differently with different doses of a stimulant. If a small dose is taken, we see individuals increase their attention span and decrease their motor restlessness, settling into the day. Prescribing stimulant medication is not without concerns. Some of the problems are that there is no clear way to predict how much to give to a person. The patient's response to the medication has no reliable biological predictors like weight. So doctors have to guess at starting dose and then modify the dose as needed, and this is called titrating, until the desired effect is achieved. Side effects are another issue. Some people experience insomnia, weight loss, nausea, and irritability, especially as the medication wears off. Research shows that most prescribed stimulants for ADHD are safe and effective when taken as prescribed. This does not mean that the stimulant medication should always be used to treat ADHD. It should be noted that there are also several non-stimulant medications and antidepressants that are prescribed for ADHD. Although stimulants help address the behavioral symptoms of ADHD, there is no clear evidence showing improvements in learning. This is a critical point and should be carefully considered before a child is placed on a stimulant medication. The medicine is a moderator of behavior. It is not a drug that can produce a greater ability to study effectively, improve test grades, or socialize more effectively. There is a difference between spending more time quietly looking at your math worksheet and actually learning math. Teachers and parents are often so impressed by the improvement in behavior that they fail to recognize there are still many other issues to address. The bottom line is that stimulant medication is potentially a useful tool in behavior management of students with ADHD. It should never be seen as a solution or used without a thorough evaluation of the student's problems and concerns. One of the most prominent educational approaches focuses on the student's behavior. Specifics vary, but a behavioral approach helps structure the student's environment so that the reinforcements are given for desired behaviors. These behavioral approaches can be used in addition to or in place of medication. One study found that students who used a behavioral self-reinforcement program in addition to medication were able to complete more assignments than students taking medication alone. To improve academic performance, teachers need to provide special support, for example, assistance with reading comprehension. For a learning issue, the student with ADHD also benefits from a curriculum that maximizes certain environmental features. Students with ADHD appear to rely more heavily on novel stimuli, feedback, variety, choices, activity, and challenging relevant work. Students with ADHD often have difficulty with executive functions. This means that teachers should provide the necessary structure and support needed for the student to develop a greater sense of self-regulation. Self-regulation strategies help students moderate their own behavior by having them periodically stop and check their behavior. Depending on their unique situation and skills, students are given strategies to check their behavior, whether they are on task, their social appropriateness, etc. They are asked to record their actual behavior at these checkpoints and given strategies for improvement if they are having trouble. The student and the teacher develop goals or criterion behavior, so it is clear that the student when they are succeeding. This is an excellent approach for students with ADHD. It clearly addresses their difficulty with key executive function and gives the supports to be successful. Many teachers do not look at ADHD as a problem. They see it as a different way of experiencing the world. Operating under this premise, teachers strive to find ways to modify their classrooms so that students with ADHD are not penalized for their naturally high activity levels, externally driven attention span, or impulsive behavior. Attempting to accommodate some of the child's behavior using this approach demonstrates a greater appreciation of the unique qualities of the student and allows them greater freedom to function in a more natural way. Accommodating inattention, this is from a list in your book. Seat student in a quiet area, seat student near good role models, seat student near study buddy, increase distance between desks, allow extra time to complete assigned work, shorten assignments or work periods to coincide with span of attention. You might have to use a timer. Break long assignments into smaller parts so that the student can see an end to the work. Assist a student in setting short-term goals. Give assignments one at a time to avoid work overload. Require fewer correct responses for grade. Reduce amount of homework. Instruct student in self-monitoring using cueing. Pair written instructions with oral instructions. Provide peer assistance in note-taking. Give clear, concise instructions. Seek to involve student in lesson presentation. Cue student to stay on task. And of course, to do this, you might need a private signal. Academic skills, if reading is weak, provide additional reading time, use previewing strategies, select text with less on a page, shorten amount of required reading, avoid oral reading. If oral expression is weak, accept all oral responses, substitute display for oral report, encourage student to talk about new ideas or experiences, pick topics easy for student to talk about. If written language is weak, accept non-written forms of reports, for example, displays, oral projects. Accept use of typewriter, word processor, tape recorder. Do not assign large quantities of written work. Test with multiple choice or fill in questions. In math, if their math is weak, allow use of calculator, use graph paper to space numbers, provide additional math time, provide immediate correctness, feedback, and instruction via modeling of the correct computational procedure. Accommodating their mood, provide reassurance and encouragement, compliment positive behavior and work product frequently, speak softly in non-threatening manner if the student shows nervousness, review instructions when giving new assignments to make sure student comprehends directions. Look for opportunities for student to display leadership role in class. Conference frequently with parents to learn about students' interests and achievements outside of school. Send positive notes home. Make time to talk alone with student. Encourage social interactions with classmates if student is withdrawn or excessively shy. Reinforce frequently when signs of frustration are noticed. Look for signs of stress, build up, and provide encouragement or a reduced workload to alleviate pressure and avoid temper outbursts. Spend more time talking to a student who seem pent up or display anger easily. Provide brief training in anger control. Encourage student to walk away. Use calming strategies. Tell nearby adults if they are getting angry. Accommodating motor activity allows students to stand at times while working. Provide opportunity for seat breaks, i.e., run errands, etc. Provide short break between assignments. Supervise closely during transition times. Remind student to check over work product if performance is rushed and careless. Give extra time to complete tasks, especially for students with slow motor tempo. Accommodating impulsiveness, ignore minor inappropriate behavior, increase immediacy of rewards and consequences, use timeout procedure for misbehavior, supervise closely during transition times, use prudent reprimands for misbehavior, for example, avoid lecturing or criticism, attend to positive behavior with compliments, etc. Acknowledge positive behavior of nearby students. Seat student near role model or near teacher. Set up behavior contract. Instruct student in self-monitoring or behavior, for example, hand raising and calling out. Call on only when hand is raised in appropriate manner. Praise when hand raised to answer questions. Compliance, praise compliant behavior, provide immediate feedback, ignore minor misbehavior, use teacher attention to reinforce positive behavior, use prudent reprimands for misbehavior, for example, avoid lecturing or criticism, acknowledge positive behavior by nearby students, supervise student closely during transition times, seat student near teacher, set up behavior contract. Didn't we already do this? Implement classroom behavior management system, instruct student in self-monitoring. Organizing and planning, ask for parental help in encouraging organization, provide organization rules, encourage student to have notebook with dividers and folders for work, provide student with homework assignment book, supervise writing down of homework assignments, send daily, weekly progress reports home, check desk and notebook regularly for neatness, encourage neatness rather than penalize sloppiness. Do not penalize for poor handwriting if visual motor defects are present. Allow student to have extra set of books at home, give assignments one at a time, assist student in setting short-term goals, encourage learning of keyboard skills, allow student to tape record assignments or homework. Socialization, praise appropriate behavior, monitor social interactions, set up social behavior goals with student and implement a reward program, prompt appropriate social behavior either verbally or with private signal, encourage cooperative learning tasks with other students, provide small group social skills training, praise student frequently, assign special responsibilities to student in presence of peer group so others observe student in a positive light. Phew, okay, well, that's ADHD. Let's talk about gifted and talented. Kind of interesting. I taught high school for 1 year, and by golly, I was in charge of the TAG program. I was in charge of the talented and gifted program. It was kind of interesting. Um, it was really kind of interesting because there was another teacher that wanted to take the students to a competition, and anyway, interesting. The federal government reauthorized the Jacob K. Javits Gifted and Talented Students Education Act of 1988 as part of an Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. Now, one of the things that happened when I was at school, I was with a really strange group of individuals. So when I started school, they gave us IQ tests, and it turned out that in my class of 72 students, there were 18 who scored at the genius level. And that's really weird, especially for, for where we were. We were a rural school. Not only were we a rural school, but most of our students were, their parents were factory workers and farmers. And we were in a county with a teacher's college. And that teacher's college had a special school for their students, for the students of the faculty. And we had more geniuses in our small community, small rural community, than they did, and they were really upset about that. So they started testing us every year, trying to figure out why in the world, why where did this anomaly come from? Why did we have so many brilliant people coming out of the farms and factories of East Central Indiana? They were just so confused. And so they tested us for years. And of course, the Jacob K. Javits Gifted and Talented program didn't exist yet because we graduated in 1967. But we may have been one of the reasons why Jacob Javits decided that he needed to pass his law. Anyway, the Javits legislation is important for education. It was really kind of fascinating because uh, they didn't have any special classes for us. They didn't even have college prep classes. We were in a high school. We were in a school that mostly educated people to be factory workers. And there were no college prep classes. There were no special classes. The only special class we had was Latin. We took Latin. We didn't have any. We didn't even have calculus. I think the highest math class we had was plane geometry, I believe. Anyway, and most of you guys have had calculus in high school. And of course, that didn't even exist in our high school because weren't training people to be college students or even smart. They were just training people to be factory workers. And of the 18, well, about a third of the individuals were female, and most of them didn't even go to college. They just got married and had children. But of the males, two became doctors. Two became doctors. One became a lawyer. One became a veterinarian, and there were two college professors, and I was one of them. So, really kind of weird. I may be talking about this group as we go through this talented and gifted stuff. The Javits legislation is important for the education of gifted students because it provides a common definition. It also provides much needed funding for gifted programs. States can apply for grants to support services for gifted and talented youth. It also provides for leadership funding for educators to broaden their understanding of gifted and talented education. One of the problems that we had was most of the teachers were not talented and gifted, and they really didn't. They really couldn't keep up with the students. And the other problem was that this was 19 in the 1960s, and they were creating teachers who could teach one subject, and that was it. They weren't multifaceted. They are also couldn't come up with more than one way to do things, more than one way to think about things. And of course, when you're and we're going to talk about creativity among this strange group of individuals, but the teachers didn't seem to be able to keep up with us. It was really kind of weird. And there were 18 of us. It's not like there were one or two kids that they could shove off into the corner someplace. There were 18 of us. That's a lot. It also provides for leadership funding for educators to broaden their understanding of gifted and talented education. Unfortunately, the law does not mandate services or specific programs for gifted students. Um, we'll talk about that in a minute. The lack of centralized mandated program often leads to substantial differences in program quality. And of course, the TAG program in Michigan isn't the same as the TAG program in Mississippi, which is not the same as the TAG program in North Carolina, which isn't anywhere close to the TAG program in Montana, which doesn't exist at all. Gifted programs also vary in quality because schools design gifted programs around different definitions of giftedness. The federal definition has found its way into many state laws, but other definitional approaches are common. Renzulli defines giftedness by the characteristics needed to produce exceptional work. According to Renzulli's theory, there are three important factors: above average ability, task commitment, and creativity. According to Renzulli, gifted students can apply their talents to general performance areas like math or language arts and to a wide range of specific performance areas like poetry, clothes design, or architecture. Now, it was really kind of strange because I have a sister that was quite bright, um, and of these three things, she had above average ability. She had task commitment, out the yin yang, but she had no creativity whatsoever. So I don't know if she was that brilliant or not, according to Renzulli. One of the longest running studies of gifted children is a study started by Louis Terman in the 1920s. Now, Terman's kind of interesting because he's the individual that was tasked with creating an IQ test for World War I soldiers. And so he and a group of psychologists came up with an IQ test. And what they discovered was the average soldier was not real bright. That's what they discovered. So he decided that he would study brilliant people after this. And so in the 1920s, he put together this study. And he had select criteria. He was out in California. So these are kids from California. I dropped my socks. He studied over 1,000 children with IQ scores over 140 that provided a valuable look at the qualities and characteristics of very intelligent people. Now, his study was 140. When I was talking about my classmates, our criteria was over 130. So it was a little bit different than what Terman was looking at. There is certainly variability in participant population. In general, they were more emotionally stable, they were more athletic, and they were better adjusted as adults. They also had lower rates of divorce, drug problems, and delinquency. The Terman studies are important because they are a lengthy follow-up of a single cohort of individuals, but the studies are not without their critics. Many of the students in Terman's study came from upper income families whose resources may have helped their children regardless of intellectual ability. It's really kind of fascinating. When I was, my kids were both tag students. Um, when we went to Germany, my wife is an officer in the United States Air Force, and I was enlisted. So when she took my daughter in to the school, and she got into the TAG program right away, and I took my son in. Of course, I'm enlisted, so I don't look like I'm not as important as my wife is. And he scored exactly the same as my daughter did, and he didn't get into the TAG program. And one of the reasons might have been political. And that's what I told them. And they didn't like that. But, that's just the way it works. So there's a lot of politics involved in this. And so when we're talking about intelligent people, and we're talking about brilliant people, and we're talking about people's children, a lot of times people would get into the tag program just because their mom or dad was a teacher, or just because their mom or dad were important in the town, or whatever. I've seen all of these things in my many years of dealing with educational systems. Educational systems are political systems as well, and that the politics have a lot to do with things. Winter in 1996 proposed three qualities that define the remarkable abilities of giftedness. Precocity. Children who are gifted explore a domain of interest at an accelerated rate. They make earlier gains in the area than their peers and reach mastery at an early age. Learning in this domain has an effortless quality, and they appear to enjoy the process. Insistence on marching to their own drummer. Learning for the child who is gifted is qualitatively different, not just accelerated. They resist explicit instruction. They enjoy learning on their own and create their own learning path. Passion to master. Children who are gifted display an intense internal motivation. Their desire to learn often takes on an obsessive quality, requiring little parental support. Additional research on the characteristics of children who are gifted shows that they are less conforming to peer opinions, adjust better emotionally, and have superior leadership skills. Not all research shows a positive outcome for children who are gifted. Research also has shown that children who are gifted have a higher level of emotional reactivity, and may have higher levels of emotional reactivity, and may have lower self-concept. Okay. It is important to keep in mind that participant populations across these studies vary, and teachers should use caution when applying research findings to specific students. A point to consider when thinking of the characteristics of children who are gifted is their similarity to children with ADHD. There are certainly differences between the two student populations, but there is enough overlap that diagnostic decisions are complicated. In ADHD, the issue is with impaired ability to internally direct attention. External stimuli cannot easily be ignored, leading to a limited attention span. The child who is gifted also has trouble with task persistence, but the cause of their trouble is that they are frequently educated in a manner that is not sufficiently challenging, particularly if their exceptionality is unrecognized. This leads to boredom, which in turn makes it difficult to stay on task. Teachers need to look beyond the behavior and consider the underlying causes. Now, I was really kind of lucky. I'm talking about the 18 kids that scored over 130 on the IQ test. We were lucky in that we were given an IQ test, and it really didn't matter who we were. Of the 18 of us, whether we were factory workers' kids, I was a banker and a nurse's kid. Most of them were farmers' kids, if I remember correctly. Anyway, it really didn't matter. But in some circumstances, poorer kids from a lower socioeconomic situation, are ignored as even if they are exceptional, and this can be a problem. So they will probably be diagnosed with ADHD because they're smart, and they get bored easily, and they're not being challenged. The nature of evaluation for giftedness depends on the model and a particular school uses for identification. Some schools screen entire grades for students who are gifted. That's what my school did. And one of the reasons that they did was because we were getting free IQ tests from the local teachers college, because they were training people to give the IQ test. So we all got to take it, but we all got to take it every year. What they were finding is there were, 3 or 4 people in every class. We had a large class, 72 people, but 18 was beyond anything that anybody could imagine. My brothers and sisters were all identified as well, uh, but they were identified as, one of five or one of four, whatever. And my sister's class, my sister was a year ahead of me. In her class, there were only 3 people that scored over 130, and she was one of them. It got kind of interesting because she had a reading problem, and she didn't like to read. She didn't like to. She could identify the words. That wasn't the problem. Her problem was that she couldn't pronounce the words. And so when they asked her to read, she could read really fairly rapidly, but she got a lot of the words wrong. And then because she didn't like to read, she wasn't as familiar with all these words and didn't know the definitions. Anyway, she had a pretty high IQ, but she didn't like to read. And she still doesn't like to read. What are we talking about? Okay, so some schools test everybody. They use group IQ and achievement tests to screen for students who might be eligible for services. The group approach is attractive for screening, but it opens the possibility for gifted services to the entire population being tested. Other approaches rely on teacher or parent nomination for evaluation. Really bad way to do it because teachers are prejudiced. They like certain students, they don't like other students, they may be racist. There's just a ton of different reasons. And of course, all parents think their children are brilliant. Once a given student is identified as possibly needing services for giftedness, they're likely to receive an individually administered IQ test. Using an IQ cutoff score has historically been a prominent approach to establishing eligibility for gifted programs. Other newer approaches take a more comprehensive look at the student and their abilities. Although there is a general trend to do less testing when determining giftedness, one area that has been greater attention is creativity. Creativity is often defined as having 2 qualities: originality and functionality. This means that it is not only important to produce or do something novel, but also that it needs to have some functional outlet to be considered a creative work. In schools, a commonly used test of creativity is the Torrance tests of creative thinking. This test specifically looks at 3 facets of divergent thinking. Okay, I was going to say something. What was I going to say? Uh-oh, my memory's going. Creativity, okay, I can't remember. Functional, I was going to tell you about, okay, we're talking about creativity. I was just reading on CNN, they were talking about they're going to auction off a picture, and it's a picture of a banana duct taped to a white wall. That's it. That's all there is. And they say that it will probably fetch $1.5 million for a picture. And this is a photograph of a banana duct taped to a white wall. And okay, anyway, that's creativity for you. That hits originality, I'm guessing, but I'm not sure how functional it is. Divergent thinking is the ability to think of multiple solutions to a given problem. This is contrasted with convergent thinking, the ability to think of the one correct solution. The blue is divergent, the convergent is red. The 3 facets of divergent thinking measured by Torrance test of creativity are fluency, flexibility, and originality. Fluency refers to the ability to produce many ideas. For example, 30 different uses for a brick. Flexibility refers to the ability to think in categorically different ways. For example, bricks can be used as a paperweight, as bricks can be used as building materials, and these are two categorically different uses: paperweights and building material. Originality is the ability to think of unusual responses. For example, a brick can be broken and the pieces used to replace bone in a person that a person has broken, and the answer is no. That's you can't do that. Bricks are organic material, and if you try to replace somebody's bone with a brick, then the brick will dissolve. And well, anyway, sorry. I know too much, so this example is not a good one. Historically, there appears to be a view of gifted education that less is best practice. Less is the best practice. Some view students who are gifted as so self-motivated that no special educational modifications are needed. This is not the case. All students need an educational program that is suited to their individual learning needs. Students who are gifted are no different. Research shows that teachers are not increasing their use of such differentiated learning practices with students with exceptional gifts. If schools are to meet the need of students, they need to be sensitive to the individual. This means teachers will need many educational tools to meet the wide variety of student needs. One persistent controversy in gifted education is over-acceleration versus enrichment. Acceleration is the process of providing an advanced instructional setting to meet the needs of exceptional learners, commonly thought of as skipping grades. Enrichment is the process of providing advanced learning opportunities while maintaining students' regular educational placement. Research provides positive support for the acceleration of students who are gifted. Students appear to benefit from higher achievement and more positive self-concepts. They do not appear to suffer from greater social problems as is commonly believed. Acceleration. Skipping grades. Super Mario. Accelerating students doesn't have to mean skipping grades. There are other ways to accelerate students who are gifted. They may be moved to another grade for instruction only in the area of their strength. Young children may simply start school early. And this is what happened when I was teaching high school. I had, oh man, I had a brother and sister in the same grade, but he was 2 years younger than her. And he had started, he was so precocious that when she started school, he started school. Well, you can imagine how upset that made her. It really did. Anyway, yeah, they were juniors together. And he was only 14 and she was 16. Maybe he was 15 and she was 17. Anyway, they may be moved to another grade. Okay. Adolescents may leave their high school earlier in the day to take classes at a local college. Enrichment approaches attempt to give the student challenging learning opportunities in their current grade placement. The difficulty with this approach is that the teacher often finds it necessary to give the advanced student independent work while attending to the more typically developing student majority. At times this works given the exceptional internal motivation of these students, but the loss of active teaching may limit their progress. Another easy to implement approach to gifted education is called curriculum packing. Curriculum packing is a technique to help teachers make appropriate curricular adjustments depending on the specific learning needs of the student. It is a system to help teachers modify daily lessons to meet the needs of each student. The system is an approach to techniques teachers are already using. Curriculum packing has 3 basic phases. The first phase is to have the teacher thoroughly define their goals for a particular lesson or unit. This can be a bulleted or numbered list of goals or objectives. The teacher determines which students have mastered all or most of the goals for their unit. For those students who demonstrate mastery of the current lesson objectives, replacement material is provided that appropriately challenges the student. This supports each student's continued intellectual growth. Problem-based learning is another popular approach used with students who are gifted. This approach is a student-centered technique based on constructivist principles that typically helps students use self-directed group-based learning to work through real-life open-ended problems. Now, this may sound kind of complex, but the reality is this is what we used when I was teaching high school, the 1 year I taught high school. This is the approach that they used. They sent these kids off to a competition where they did several different things, but one of the main thing that they did was take a world problem and come up with novel solutions to the problem. It was really kind of interesting. So they practiced solving world problems. It was really kind of interesting. And it was also kind of boring. And what I had the kids do, I had them play games. This was before video games. So we were playing strategy games. One of them was Dungeons and Dragons, which, well, anyway, we won't get into the controversy over Dungeons and Dragons at the time. It had to do with religion. Anyway, we were playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I thought that was a good way for them to think and to solve problems. Because what you do in Dungeons and Dragons is you move from one place to the next, and you have to solve, you have to fight this person, or you have to find something, or you have to solve a riddle in order to go to the next thing. And it really worked. I thought it really worked because, for one thing, my kids were having a lot more fun. And they were solving a lot more problems. How many times can you solve world hunger, and just how into it can the kids get when they know that whatever they come up with, somebody's going to reject. Anyway, not important. It is important to develop a real life problem that the students find engaging, and that's the hard part is finding something that's engaging. The problem can be co-designed with the students to increase student investment. It is also important to have an ill-defined problem or one with multiple solutions. This is because the approach is essentially an exercise in divergent thinking. The students are encouraged to think creatively and come up with multiple solutions to the problems. This requires critical thinking and active learning. Research shows that problem-based learning can motivate students to actively participate in their own learning, but this needs to be balanced with more traditional instruction in the content material. Much of the educational process is geared toward teaching students to find the correct answer. On the surface, this sounds like a positive goal, but there are some issues with focusing too heavily on such convergent thinking approaches. Finding the correct answer often requires a thorough and productive brainstorming process. Brainstorming is a divergent thinking process and is just as crucial as convergent thinking. Teachers need to help students develop both thinking approaches, convergent and divergent. Come up with the one right answer or come up with novel solutions. One way to encourage creative thinking is to provide a safe, risk-free learning environment. Teachers need to create a comfortable learning environment where students feel safe to ask any question and offer any response. This is a challenging task. Often teachers who attempt to create a relaxed and safe learning environment feel that unusual student responses and questions derail curricular progress. They may inadvertently suppress such questions by subtle looks or differentially reinforcing more traditional student questions. The downside is that students will fail to develop their creative thinking ability. This may mean that they have difficulty reaching correct solutions to problems because they are unable to think of a sufficient range of possible answers. One of the significant changes seen in schools across the last 20 years is the growing appreciation of families as collaborators in education. This is true for every student, but takes on special meaning for families of students with exceptionalities. Families are the foundational structure from which children emerge to grow and explore the world. Family influence on the educational lives of students is significant and vital to their achieving the best educational experience. Families are highly interactive and interdependent groups. Families rely on each other for social and financial support. We also look to our families for emotional support and understanding. This is an incredibly complicated system, yet one with which teachers need to become familiar to provide the best educational experience for students. Bronfenbrenner describes developmental life in the context of larger familial, community, and societal levels. His ecological theory stresses the importance of these larger layers of influence if one is to fully understand the development of the child. Parents actively participate in educational planning and help provide the important look at the context in which students live and learn. Viewing parents as collaborators gives teachers better tools to understand factors affecting student success. This is particularly true when a student has an exceptional learning need. Whether the identification of a special need is new or long-standing, the nature of the exceptionality affects the entire family. In turn, the family affects the motivation, outlook, and success of the student. The dynamic relationships within a family mean that adjustment problems experienced by the student will have an impact on the relationship of the parents. Parental reactions will depend on numerous factors. One potential outcome is that parents might experience marital difficulties following a disability diagnosis. The research on this topic is mixed. Some studies find an increase in marital issues, whereas others find the opposite effect. It appears to depend on the unique situation of the family, and teachers should remain sensitive to this and provide support and appropriate resources. For many, sibling bonds are the first significant social network in a child's development. This relationship is typically altered by the knowledge that a child has a disability. Sometimes the nature of the disability limits the social interactions of siblings because of the amount of parental attention required to care for the child. Sometimes this leads to positive interactions among siblings as siblings take on socially supportive roles. Other times, siblings can develop anger and resentment. Until recently, little research focused on the impact of extended family members on the life of the child with an exceptional learning need. Grandparents usually have multiple concerns when they learn a grandchild has an exceptional learning need. They care for the well-being and education of their grandchild, but they also care for their own child, the parent, and the difficulties they encounter raising a child with special needs. Many grandparents provide generous emotional support for their child, the parent, and their struggles rearing a child with disability. This depends on the grandparent's own perception of the grandchild's needs. Grandparents can provide additional stressors if they fail to perceive the situation in a positive light. For families dealing with a child with special learning needs, it is about having a positive outlook and hard work. Cultures around the world vary in how they perceive someone as different and how they behave towards such individuals. Much of the United States and Eastern Europe still see differences as negative, which potentially results in separation from mainstream society. This is interesting because Western cultures also tend to hold a medical view of disability, believing that disabilities can be identified and treated. And this is a child from China who has Down syndrome. Other cultures have a very different belief structure regarding disability. Some see a disability as the will of a higher power. Asian cultures often see a disability as a source of shame or embarrassment. And when I found this picture, they said, "This is the last Downy in China," and we won't talk about what they do. They euthanize them. I guess I did talk about what they do. These belief structures make it more difficult for teachers to develop productive and collaborative educational relationships. Teachers, however, can make every effort to help parents view their child's situation as one where positive change can be made. It requires the teacher to maintain a sensitivity and understanding for the unique cultural heritage of the parents. They also need to demonstrate their willingness and obligation to the appropriate education of the student and their belief in the student's ability to make positive change. And I need to go back and explain to you what's going on. In China, you're only allowed to have one child if you live in a city. And so what was happening, if they if they detected that the child had any kind of abnormality, they were terminating the pregnancy. Let's call it that. Okay. Anyway, so there were very few children with Down syndrome being born, but it had to do with a lot of social policies that they had in China, and one of them was a political decision that Mao Zedong determined. He was trying to reduce the number of people in China, and he did that by saying that if you lived in a rural environment, you could have two or three children, depending on how much help you needed on the farm. And if you lived in an urban area, you could only have one child. And so people were selecting the gender of their child. There were a lot more males being born. This has been a really serious problem in China because they have a lot more males than they have females. It's about 60-40. That's because they selected the males. They wanted males. Anyway, we won't go into the rest of it. It's all political and cultural. It requires the teacher to maintain a sensitivity and understanding of the unique cultural heritage of the parents. You should always be aware of that. They also need to demonstrate their willingness and obligation to the appropriate education of students and their belief in the student's ability to make positive changes. These two are children with Down syndrome in Romania, and Romania is an Eastern European country where disabilities are seen as a negative. Gifted programs across the nation suffer from issues that are almost the mirror image of those found among students receiving services under IDEA. In 2017-2018, the National Center for Educational Statistics reported that 12.6% of students of Asian descent were in gifted programs. 12.6%. This compared to 8.1% for white students, 4.9% for American Indian Alaska Native students, 4.5% for Hispanic students, and 3.6% for black students. Now, how much of this has to do with racial prejudice? It's hard to say. It's really hard to say. And that is it. So I'll talk to you guys later, next week. And I'm not sure what next week's chapter is about.